The morning my mother-in-law handed me a printed list of my financial deficiencies, typed, single-spaced, 12 items long, with a cover note that said for Serena's consideration, I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam a single door on my way out of that house. I folded the paper in half. I placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket, against my chest, where it sat for the next 11 months like a compass. Not a compass pointing toward confrontation. A compass pointing toward something more precise than that. Toward the moment when I would own the building they lived in. Let me back up. Hello. Welcome, and if you are new here, I am genuinely glad you found this channel. My name is Serena Whitmore. I am 34 years old. I am a private equity analyst, which means I spend my professional life identifying undervalued assets, understanding what they are actually worth, and positioning myself to acquire them at the precise moment when the opportunity is most advantageous. I have been doing this for 9 years. I am very good at it. I am also the woman who was handed a 12-point document detailing why she was not good enough to be married to the man she had been with for 3 years, living with for 1, and planning a future within the kind of quiet, genuine, unglamorous way that does not make good television, but makes a good life. I am going to tell you exactly what happened, what was on that list, what I found when I started looking, what I built in the 11 months between the day I was handed that document and the day I sat across a conference table from my in-laws and explained to them, very gently, what they had done to themselves. Before we go further, this story is real. Some names, identifying details, and specific timelines have been adjusted for privacy and for storytelling clarity. Nothing in this video is legal or financial advice. What it is the most precise accounting of the most personal professional project I have ever undertaken. Drop in the comments where you are watching from. I am in Chicago right now, and it is very cold, and I want the company of people who understand what it is to be underestimated by the people who should know better. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. And let's begin. My husband's name is James Whitmore. He is 36 years old, an architect, genuinely kind in a way that is not performed, and possessed of a specific blindness to his parents that I understood, from early in our relationship, was the product of love and not negligence. He saw them the way children see parents, through the filter of everything they had done right, which was considerable, and with a persistent inability to weigh that against what they were doing wrong. His parents, Richard and Gloria Pemberton, were, on the surface, the kind of people who photograph well at charity events. Richard was a retired commercial real estate developer, 67 years old, who had made a significant amount of money in the Chicago market in the 1990s and early 2000s, and had spent the subsequent 2 decades managing those assets and managing the impression that the assets were larger than they were. He wore bespoke suits and spoke about his portfolio the way men of his generation speak about their portfolios, in round numbers at volume, with the absolute confidence of someone who has never had to be specific because specificity, in his world, was a form of weakness. Gloria was 64, a former interior designer who had retired when James was in high school and had channeled her considerable energy into the management of her social life, her appearance, and her son's choices. She was charming in the specific way of women who have spent 40 years in rooms where charm was the primary currency, effortlessly and without warmth. She called me honey from the first time we met, which I understood immediately was not affection but placement. Honey is what you call someone you have already decided does not require your full attention. I had grown up in Detroit, the daughter of a high school chemistry teacher and a hospital administrator. We were not wealthy. We were not poor. We were the specific American middle class that produces, in its children, either a profound comfort with ordinary life or a profound hunger to build something different. I had been the second kind since approximately the age of 14, when I discovered that spreadsheets made sense to me in a way that most things did not, and that making sense of numbers was a skill that the world paid for generously if you were willing to develop it with enough discipline. I had put myself through college on a combination of scholarships, work-study, and 2 part-time jobs. I had graduated with honors in finance and economics. I had completed my MBA at 26 with a full merit scholarship. I had joined a mid-sized private equity firm in Chicago at 27, where I had spent 7 years becoming the youngest senior analyst in the firm's history, managing a portfolio of 11 assets with a combined value of $340 million. I did not lead with these credentials. I am not that kind of person. I dress well, but not expensively. I drive a 3-year-old Honda that I own outright. I live in a clean, comfortable apartment in Lincoln Park that I chose because it suited my life, not because it impressed anyone. I do not perform wealth. I build it. This, I would discover, was the specific thing about me that Richard and Gloria Pemberton found most incomprehensible. Before I tell you about James, I want to tell you something about Richard and Gloria Pemberton that took me 11 months to fully understand, something that was invisible at first because they had spent decades making it invisible, and that became visible only when I started looking with the specific tools I had been trained to use. Richard Pemberton's wealth narrative went like this. He had built a commercial real estate empire in Chicago in the 1990s, had sold several major assets at peak valuations in the early 2000s, and had retired into the comfortable management of a portfolio that, by his telling, generated enough passive income to sustain the Kenilworth house, the Lake Geneva property, the cars, the charity dinners, and the general performance of a life that cost approximately $480,000 a year to maintain. I know that number precisely because I calculated it later. But from the outside, the performance was convincing. The house was real. The suits were real. The way Richard talked about money, the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who has not had to think about a price tag in 20 years, was real in the sense that it had been practiced so long it had become indistinguishable from genuine ease. What I could not see, in those early years of dinners and holiday visits and carefully managed conversations, was the structure beneath the performance. The gap between what they appeared to own and what they actually owned. The specific, quiet desperation of people who have been maintaining a lifestyle on diminishing returns for long enough that the maintenance itself has become the primary activity of their lives. I would see it later. I would see all of it. But in 2019 and 2020 and 2021, I saw only the performance. And the performance was good enough that even I, a person professionally trained to look behind performances, took longer than I would like to admit to start questioning it. What accelerated my questioning was the document. Specifically, point 5. Financial compatibility is essential. A partner whose assets are primarily income-based rather than wealth-based creates an imbalance. That line sat in me for 3 days after I read it. It sat in me the way a specific kind of puzzle sits in a person who is built to solve puzzles, not as an insult but as an invitation. Because here is what that line revealed to someone who understood what it was saying. It revealed that Richard Pemberton distinguished between income-based assets and wealth-based assets in a way that only makes sense if you are performing the second category while actually living in the first. Genuinely wealthy people do not make this distinction out loud.
They do not need to.
The distinction only becomes important, only becomes the thing you write down and hand to your son's girlfriend in a cream-colored envelope when your own position in the second category is less secure than you are presenting. I was an income-based asset person. That was true. I earned well and invested the surplus with discipline. I did not have generational wealth. I did not have a portfolio of inherited property or a trust fund or a family name that opened certain doors. What I had was $2.3 million in managed investment accounts, a private equity track record that any institutional investor in the country would recognize as exceptional, and the specific professional skill set for identifying exactly what someone's assets are actually worth when they stop telling you, and you start looking. The document told me to start looking.
So I did.
James and I met at a conference in 2019, an urban development summit where he was presenting on sustainable residential design, and I was there to evaluate a potential acquisition in the mixed-use development space. We had dinner that night with a group of 8 people and ended up talking until the restaurant closed. He was the only architect I had ever met who understood bond structures. I was the only financier he had ever met who could explain why a building's load-bearing design affected its resale cap rate. We were together officially within 6 weeks. I met his parents at Christmas of 2019. The first dinner was fine. Gloria asked me what I did, and I explained it simply. Richard asked which firm, and I told him. He nodded in the way of a man who has looked up the information and found it adequate, but not impressive. Gloria smiled and said, "That sounds very demanding. Do you ever worry you won't have time for a family?" I was 31 years old, and we had known each other for 4 hours. I said, "I find that good systems make most things manageable." She laughed as if I had said something charming and changed the subject. I noted it. I filed it. I continued eating the excellent roast chicken she had made, which was the most genuine thing about the entire evening. Over the following 2 years, I met them approximately a dozen times. Holidays, birthday dinners, one weekend trip to their house in Lake Geneva that James had been excited about and that I had found instructive. The dynamic was consistent. Richard performed authority, Gloria performed warmth, and both of them performed, with increasing transparency, the assessment of whether I was adequate. The specific metrics of their assessment were financial. This became clearer as time went on and as James and I became more serious. They wanted to know where I lived, which I told them. They wanted to know if I owned or rented, which I told them. Rented because in Chicago, with my income and investment strategy, renting and deploying my capital more efficiently made more financial sense than buying at that moment. Richard received this information the way people receive information that does not fit their framework. He smiled and said nothing and moved on. Gloria, at a dinner in March 2021, asked me whether I had family money. I told her I did not. My parents were both educators. I had built my career from scratch. She nodded. "James has always been so good at finding interesting people," she said. Interesting people. Not accomplished ones. Not impressive ones. Interesting ones. The specific category into which you place someone when you have decided they are a curiosity rather than a candidate. I noted it. I filed it. James proposed in September 2021. I said yes because I loved him and because the 12-point document had not yet been written. I said yes because James was the kind of person who made me better and who I hoped to make better in return, and because the specific toxicity of his parents had not yet produced anything I could not manage. That was about to change. We moved in together in January 2022 into a larger apartment in Lincoln Park that was genuinely mine. I had been living there for 2 years, but that James moved into when his lease ended. We split expenses proportionally based on income, which was my system, and which James found logical and fair. We were planning a wedding for the following spring. In February 2022, Gloria called James and told him she needed to speak with us both about the future. James, who had never learned to hear the specific frequency of his mother's manipulations, told her we would come for dinner on Saturday. He told me she probably just wanted to discuss the wedding. I did not argue. I made a mental note, and I went to the dinner. The dinner was at their house in Kenilworth, a substantial property, approximately 4,200 square feet, in a neighborhood where that represented a specific tier of arrival. Richard had a particular way of moving through that house that communicated ownership, not just of the space, but of everyone in it. We ate. The food was good. The conversation was managed with the precision of people who know where they're going and are taking their time getting there. After dinner, Richard went to his study. James went to help Gloria with the dishes, a habit from his childhood that she had carefully maintained. And Gloria, while the water was running and James was drying plates with his back to the room, slid a cream-colored envelope across the kitchen counter to me. "I prepared some thoughts," she said, "for your consideration. I think it will help us all be on the same page about what James needs." I took the envelope. I did not open it at the table. I put it in my jacket pocket. I finished my glass of wine. I helped clear the remaining dishes. I said goodnight to Richard, who had returned from his study smelling faintly of whiskey and satisfaction, and I drove James home while he talked about a project he was excited about, and I listened and responded in the right places and said nothing about the envelope until I was alone. At 11:47 p.m., Sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of water and my laptop open to a blank document, I opened the envelope. The document inside was 2 pages, single-spaced, printed on good cream paper that matched the envelope. At the top, for Serena's consideration, a note on James's future. 12 points. I am going to give you the most relevant ones because they are the specific coordinates from which everything else in this story was navigated. Point 3. James requires a partner who brings equivalent social capital to the relationship. This includes family background, community standing, and established networks. Serena's background, while admirable in its own way, does not reflect the world James was raised in. Point 5. Financial compatibility is essential. James has grown up with certain expectations regarding lifestyle and security. A partner whose assets are primarily income-based rather than wealth-based creates an imbalance that historically produces resentment and instability in marriages of this kind. Point 7. Property ownership signals commitment and stability. A woman of Serena's age, who has not yet purchased property, may not share James's long-term vision for the kind of home and family environment that his upbringing has prepared him to provide. Point 11. We would ask Serena to consider whether her professional ambitions are compatible with the kind of presence and availability that James and, eventually, a family will require. Point 12. We love James and want only what is best for him. We hope Serena will understand that this note comes from that love and will give serious thought to whether she is the right partner for the life he deserves. I read it twice. I read it the way I read due diligence reports, completely, without reaction, noting each item, assessing its implications. Then I folded it in half. I placed it against my chest in my jacket pocket. I opened the blank document on my laptop and I typed 4 words at the top of it. What do they own? Because here is the thing about 12 points of detailed, specific financial criticism delivered by people who have been performing wealth for 2 decades. The specific nature of the criticism tells you something about the critic. Point 5. Assets primarily income-based rather than wealth-based. Point 7. Property ownership signals commitment and stability. These were not the concerns of genuinely wealthy people. Genuinely wealthy people do not need to write these things down. They do not need to explain the hierarchy to the person below them in it. These were the concerns of people whose wealth was more performance than substance. I was a private equity analyst. Identifying the gap between performance and substance was my entire professional skill set. I was going to find the gap. I did not tell James about the document immediately. I told him 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, when I had had time to process it without the processing being visible in real time. I showed it to him. He read it. His face did something I had not seen it do before, a specific collapse of the expression he usually wore, the one that said my parents mean well, and what replaced it was not anger but devastation, which was in some ways worse.
Serena, he said. I know, I said.
I'm going to call them.
Don't, I said.
Not yet.
He looked at me.
I want to understand the full situation before we respond, I said. Let me do what I do.
He trusted me.
That was the thing about James that had always been true. He trusted me not because I asked him to, but because I had never given him a reason not to. He put the document down on the table between us and he said, "Okay." That was the last conversation we had about it for 11 months. Not because I was withholding. Because I was working. In March 2022, Gloria escalated. She called James and told him that she and Richard had discussed the situation and they had a proposal. They would like James to move back into the family home in Kenilworth, just temporarily, while you think things through, and they would support him financially while he took stock of his relationship and his future. She framed it as an offer of support. She framed it as love. What it was an ultimatum with a softer delivery mechanism. James told her he would think about it. He told me that evening. I watched his face while he told me, and I understood that the part of him that had grown up in that house, that had been shaped by those people in ways that were not visible until they were activated by pressure, was genuinely considering it. "James," I said, "I'm not going to tell you what to do. I know. But I need you to know that I am not going anywhere. Whatever you decide about your parents, I am not leaving. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do?"
"My job," I said.
He nodded. He called his mother the next day and told her he was staying. Gloria received this information with the specific grace of a woman who had prepared for this outcome and had a secondary plan. She said she understood. She said the door was always open. She said she hoped Serena would eventually come to appreciate how much they cared. 2 weeks later, I received a legal letter. Not addressed to me personally, addressed to both of us, at our apartment address. From a property management company called Pemberton Asset Management LLC, a company I had not yet encountered, but whose name I recognized immediately as Richard's. The letter informed us that the building we were living in was under new management, that our lease would not be renewed at its expiration in 90 days, and that we should make arrangements accordingly. Let me explain why this letter was significant beyond the obvious. We had been living in that apartment for 2 years. I had signed the lease before James moved in, directly with the building's property management company, a company called Lakeside Residential Partners, which was the name on every piece of correspondence I had received for 24 months. I had never heard the name Pemberton Asset Management until this letter. I had never been informed of a change of ownership or management. I had never been given any indication that the building had any connection to my future in-laws. The letter was signed by a property manager named Keith Donovan. The LLC was registered in Illinois. The letter used language that was precise and professional and designed to appear routine, a standard non-renewal notice, the kind that tenants receive and process as an administrative matter. I did not process it as an administrative matter. I processed it as information. The question the letter raised was not where are we going to live. We had options. I had options specifically. I had the capital to buy an apartment outright if I chose to, a fact that Richard and Gloria had dismissed as irrelevant because the capital was income-based rather than wealth-based, which was, I was increasingly understanding, the most expensive misunderstanding they had ever made about me. The question the letter raised was, how did Richard Pemberton come to own the building I was living in, and when, and why did no one tell me? And the deeper question beneath that one, what else does he own that I don't know about? I sat with this letter for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Then I opened a new folder on my desktop. I labeled it Pemberton. I made a cup of coffee. I sat back down at my desk. Outside my window, Chicago in March was the specific gray of a city that has been cold for too long and is not yet ready to forgive itself for it. The lake was invisible in the morning fog. The street below was quiet. I opened a new document inside the folder. At the top, I typed the same 4 words I had typed the night I read the envelope. What do they own? And then, below it, I typed a second line that I had not been ready to type 11 months earlier. Everything. And I went to work. Here is what I knew about Pemberton Asset Management LLC before I started looking. The name. The registered agent address, a law firm on LaSalle Street that specialized in corporate formation, which told me nothing specific except that Richard had used counsel, which was not surprising. The letter it had sent me. The signature of Keith Donovan, property manager. Here is what I knew about private equity due diligence before I started looking. Everything. I had spent 9 years building a methodology for understanding the true financial position of a company or individual whose stated position and actual position might not align. I had done it for acquisition targets and for portfolio companies and for distressed assets and for counterparties in deals where the information asymmetry was the entire game. I had done it with teams and with consultants and with lawyers and with forensic accountants. I had a process. I had tools. I had a network. What I had never done was apply those tools to someone I was about to have Thanksgiving dinner with. The conflict of interest was real. I noted it. I filed it. I proceeded. The first thing you do in any asset investigation is the thing that costs nothing and reveals more than people expect. You pull the public record. In Illinois, property ownership is public. Corporate registrations are public. Court filings are public. UCC filings, the security agreements that tell you who has loaned money against which assets, are public. Most people do not know how to read these records or where to find them. Most people would not think to look. I had been reading them for 9 years. Over the course of 3 evenings in March 2022, after James was asleep, at the kitchen table with my laptop and a notepad and a cup of tea that went cold most nights before I remembered to drink it, I built the beginning of a picture. Pemberton Asset Management, LLC, had been registered in Illinois in January 2022, 2 months before the letter arrived. This was recent. Too recent for a company managing a portfolio it had owned for years. This was a company that had been created for a specific purpose at a specific moment. I went further back. Before Pemberton Asset Management, LLC, who had owned my building, a company called Lakeside Residential Partners, LP, the entity I had been leasing from. I pulled its corporate registration. It had been registered in 2009, which fit the timeline of a building that had been built and leased in that period. Its registered agent was the same LaSalle Street law firm as Pemberton Asset Management. Same law firm.
Different company, but the same law firm.
I pulled the deed history for my building's address through the Cook County Recorder of Deeds. The building had transferred ownership 4 times since construction: 2009 original purchase, 2013 refinancing, technically a new ownership structure, 2017 another refinancing, and most recently December 2021, 3 months before the letter arrived. The December 2021 transfer was from Lakeside Residential Partners, LP to Pemberton Asset Management, LLC. I stared at this date for a long time. December 2021. 1 month after I had told Gloria I did not have family money. 2 months before she handed me the envelope. 3 months before the non-renewal letter arrived. The transfer was not coincidence. The transfer was a move. Richard had transferred ownership of the building into a new company specifically named after himself, apparently without concern that I might notice, specifically to give himself the legal mechanism to remove us from the property. He had built the eviction tool before the envelope was even written. I wrote that down. I added it to the folder. I kept going. If Richard had transferred one property into a newly created entity, the question was whether he had done the same with others. I spent the following 2 weeks pulling every UCC filing, every Cook County property record, every Illinois corporate registration associated with the name Pemberton, in any combination with any other word, and mapping what I found. What I found was a portfolio. Not the portfolio Richard described at dinner parties, with the round numbers and the confident gestures and the implication of generational solidity. A different portfolio. A real one. The real portfolio consisted of 7 properties across the Chicago metropolitan area, 3 apartment buildings in Lincoln Park and Lakeview, 2 small commercial properties in Wicker Park, the Kenilworth family home, and the Lake Geneva vacation property. Together, they represented a combined assessed value of approximately $12.4 million. $12 million sounds significant. It is significant in absolute terms. In the context of the lifestyle Richard and Gloria maintained, the Kenilworth house alone cost approximately $8,000 a month in carrying costs, taxes, and maintenance, which I calculated from the public assessor records, and in the context of what Richard had implied his portfolio was worth over 20 years of dinner conversations, it was not what the performance suggested. But the property values were not the most interesting thing I found. The debt was. Every property in the portfolio was leveraged. Not modestly leveraged, the way a financially prudent person levers real estate to optimize returns, but aggressively, in some cases to the point where the equity position was thin enough that a modest correction in property values or a period of vacancy would create significant problems. The Lincoln Park apartment building, not my building, a different one, had a mortgage balance of $3.2 million against an assessed value of $3.8 million. That was a loan-to-value ratio of approximately 84%. For a property that had been in the portfolio for 15 years, that ratio should have been declining. The fact that it wasn't meant one thing. The equity had been pulled out. Cash-out refinancing, almost certainly, a strategy that generates liquidity in the short term at the cost of equity in the long term. My building had a mortgage balance of $1.9 million against an assessed value of $2.4 million. Same pattern. The Kenilworth house, the house where I had been handed the 12-point document, had a mortgage balance of $2.1 million against an assessed value of $3.1 million, which was more comfortable, but was also the property they lived in, and therefore the one they were most motivated to protect. Total mortgage debt across the portfolio, approximately $9.8 million. Total assessed value, $12.4 million. Net equity, approximately $2.6 million. I built a full model, not an estimate, a model, with sources cited, with the public records attached, with every number traced to a document I could produce. I sat back in my chair at 1:23 a.m. on a Thursday night, and I looked at what I had built. Richard Pemberton was not a wealthy man. He was a highly leveraged man whose assets had been appreciating in a favorable market and whose lifestyle had been funded by the cash-out equity from those assets. He was, in financial terms, a person who had been spending his net worth for approximately a decade and had maintained the appearance of wealth by ensuring the spending was never visible as spending. It looked from the outside like income from a large portfolio, when in reality it was the gradual liquidation of equity from a moderately sized one.
He was not broke.
But he was fragile, in the specific way of assets that look solid until they don't, and then fall very fast. I added this model to the folder. I opened a new page. I wrote at the top, "What is the gap and who else knows about it?" The answer to who else knows came from a source I had not expected. My colleague at the firm, a woman named Priya Mehta, who had been in private equity for 12 years and who had spent 6 of them specifically in distressed real estate, came to me in April 2022 with a deal she was evaluating. A Chicago area residential portfolio, she said. Motivated seller. Interesting basis. She sent me the preliminary information memorandum. I opened it. The portfolio consisted of 7 properties across the Chicago metropolitan area. 3 apartment buildings in Lincoln Park and Lakeview, 2 small commercial properties in Wicker Park, a residential property in Kenilworth, and a vacation property in Lake Geneva. I read the summary 3 times. Then I called Priya. "Where did this deal come from?" I asked.
"Broker brought it in," she said.
The owner approached them directly. "Wants a clean exit, apparently. Family reasons. Do you have a name on the seller?" LLC. Pemberton Asset Management. I was quiet for a moment.
"Priya," I said,
"I have a conflict of interest on this one. I need to recuse." "What kind of conflict?" "The seller is my fiancé's father." Another moment of quiet. Then, "Serena, are you serious?" "I need you to keep this deal in the pipeline," I said. "Do not close it. Do not pass it to another buyer. Keep it warm and give me 90 days. "What are you going to do in 90 days? "Buy it myself," I said. After the call with Priya, I spent 3 weeks doing the deepest due diligence I had ever conducted on a single asset package. I hired a forensic accountant named David Choi, who had worked with my firm on 3 previous transactions and whose ability to reconstruct financial histories from public records and voluntary disclosures was, in my professional assessment, unmatched in the Chicago market. I told him I had a potential personal acquisition and needed a complete financial picture of the target portfolio. I gave him everything I had already found. He had the full model in 18 days. The model confirmed everything I had built but added 2 things I had not found on my own. The first was a tax lien. On the Wicker Park commercial property, the IRS had filed a lien in October 2021, 5 months before the non-renewal letter, for $287,000 in unpaid federal taxes. The lien had not yet been enforced, but it was recorded and it was real, and it was the kind of thing that, in a motivated seller situation, creates significant negotiating leverage for a buyer. The second was more significant. The Lake Geneva vacation property had been pledged as collateral on a personal loan in 2020, a loan of $800,000 from a private lender, with a balloon payment due in September 2023. 18 months from now. The interest rate on the loan was 11.4%, which was the rate of someone who could not get conventional financing, which meant that at the time of the loan, Richard's leverage ratios had already been high enough to make traditional lenders uncomfortable. He had a balloon payment of approximately $890,000 coming due in 18 months. His equity position across the portfolio was $2.6 million. His most liquid option for meeting the balloon payment was to sell the Lake Geneva property, but selling it would trigger a capital gains event and reduce his available equity further. Alternatively, he could refinance, but his leverage ratios made that difficult, and rising interest rates in 2022 were making it more difficult by the month. Richard Pemberton was not approaching a sale because he wanted to simplify his life. He was approaching a sale because the alternative was watching his portfolio unwind in a way he could not control. He needed a buyer. He needed one quickly. He needed one who would not use the complexity of his position as leverage against him. He had just evicted the one person in his life who understood exactly how complex that position was. If you have ever had family members underestimate you, if you have ever sat across a table from people who have assessed your worth and found it insufficient, who have handed you a document telling you who you are allowed to be, drop a 100 in the comments right now. Because what I am about to describe required something I want to be honest about. It required me to separate the personal from the professional in a way that is easy to describe and genuinely difficult to do. I was not just an analyst evaluating a distressed portfolio. I was a woman whose future mother-in-law had told her, in writing, that she was not the right kind of person for her son. Those two things had to be kept in separate containers. Not because they weren't connected. They were, but because allowing the personal to contaminate the professional analysis would have compromised the analysis. And the analysis was the point. I kept the containers separate. I did the work. I let the numbers tell the story. And the story the numbers told was this. Richard Pemberton needed to sell his portfolio, and I was in a position to buy it, and the price I could pay was fair, and the structure I could offer was clean, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about who I was. Back to the trap. In May 2022, I had a conversation with my managing partner at the firm, a man named Thomas Grayson who had hired me 7 years ago and whose professional respect I had earned specifically by never bringing him surprises. I told him I had identified a personal acquisition opportunity. I told him it was a 7-property residential and commercial portfolio in Chicago. I told him my preliminary valuation and my proposed structure. I told him about the conflict of interest and that I had already recused from the firm's involvement and was proceeding as an individual buyer. He listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them financial. I answered all 3 with numbers. You can carry this? He asked.
Comfortably, I said.
With room. He nodded. Does the seller know it's you? Not yet, I said. He looked at me for a moment over his reading glasses. When will they find out? At closing, I said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, good deal? Very good deal, I said. Then do it, he said. And Serena, he paused. Keep the personal separate from the professional. Always, I said. I had retained a real estate attorney named Constance Park 2 weeks earlier, a woman I had worked with on 3 acquisitions who was, in my assessment, the sharpest transactional attorney in Chicago for this type of deal. I had told her the same thing I told Thomas, the seller, the conflict, the structure I wanted. She had asked the same question Thomas asked. When does the seller find out it's you? At closing, I said. She had looked at me with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite approval but was somewhere in between. I like this, she said. Let's build it correctly. The acquisition structure Constance designed was elegant in the way that good legal structures are elegant, not complicated but precise. I would purchase the portfolio through a newly formed LLC, Whitmore Capital Partners LLC. The name was my married name, the name I would have when the deal closed, and it was accurate as a descriptor of what the entity was. It was also, if you were not paying close attention, not immediately identifiable as Serena Pemberton's vehicle. Richard would not be paying close attention. Richard had already assessed me and found me inadequate. Inadequate people did not, in Richard's framework, show up as the buyer on deals of this scale. That was his mistake. And it was the most expensive one he would ever make. The offer went in on June 14, 2022, at 9 a.m. through Constance's office. The purchase price was $11.2 million, a 9.7% discount to assessed value, justified by the tax lien, the balloon payment pressure, and the general condition of several of the properties as documented in the inspection reports David Choi's team had prepared. The offer included a 45-day due diligence period, a 60-day close, and an all-cash structure that eliminated financing contingencies.
Cash. No contingencies.
45 days to close. In a market where commercial real estate transactions were taking 6 to 9 months and financing was becoming increasingly difficult, an all-cash offer with a 45-day timeline was not just attractive. It was, for a seller in Richard's position, almost irresistible. Richard's broker called Constance's office within 4 hours. He accepted the offer, subject to due diligence, at 2:17 p.m. on June 14, 2022. I was in a meeting when the call came. Constance texted me. He took it. I excused myself. I went to the hallway. I stood beside a window that looked out over Michigan Avenue, and I read the text twice. Then I went back into the meeting. The 45-day due diligence period began on June 15, 2022. During that period, Constance's team and David Choi's team had full access to the financial records, leases, maintenance histories, and corporate documentation of every property in the Pemberton portfolio. What we found confirmed everything I had already known and added several things I had not. The apartment buildings were well-maintained physically but poorly managed financially. Rents were below market rate on 11 of the 23 units. Leases had been renewed on autopilot without rate adjustments, and the operating expenses had been running approximately 18% above comparable properties in the same submarkets. This was the portfolio of a man who had made good decisions 20 years ago and had been living on the momentum of those decisions ever since, without the discipline or the attention to optimize what he had built. The Wicker Park commercial properties were the most problematic. One of the two was occupied by a single tenant whose lease had expired in March 2022 and who had been operating on a month-to-month basis since. The tax lien on this property, the $287,000 federal filing, had not been disclosed in the initial offering materials, which was a problem for Richard's broker and a data point for me. Non-disclosure of a recorded lien in a sales process is the kind of thing that erodes a seller's negotiating position very quickly when it surfaces in due diligence. It surfaced on day 9. Constance called Richard's attorney. Richard's attorney called Richard. 2 days later, they came back with a price reduction request of $340,000, more than the lien amount, which told me they were scared, and a revised offer of $10.86 million. I countered at $10.95 million and asked for the lien to be satisfied at closing from the seller's proceeds. They accepted within 6 hours. The due diligence period also produced the full picture of the balloon payment. The private lender on the Lake Geneva property had, in the months since the original loan, sold the note to a secondary market investor, a detail that had not been visible in the initial record pull but that the full due diligence uncovered. The new note holder was a fund that specialized in distressed private debt. They had already sent Richard a notice that they intended to accelerate the loan if the balloon was not met on schedule in September 2023. Richard was not just motivated to sell. Richard was, by the standards of his own balance sheet, in the early stages of a financial emergency. He did not know I knew this. His broker did not know I knew this. No one on his side of the transaction knew that the buyer, Whitmore Capital Partners LLC, had the specific professional capability to read his financial position more clearly than his own advisors probably had. That information asymmetry was worth more than the price discount. It was worth the entire deal. David Choi delivered his final report on July 8, 2022, 3 weeks into the due diligence period. He sat across from me in my office and he walked me through everything. When he finished, he closed his laptop and he looked at me. "This is a solid acquisition," he said. "Even at full ask, this would have been a solid acquisition. At the price you're getting it, it's exceptional."
"I know," I said.
He looked at me for a moment. Personal connection to the seller? I had told him about the conflict. He was the kind of professional for whom knowing the full picture was necessary to doing the work correctly. "He's my fiancé's father," I said. David nodded slowly. "Does he know who he's selling to?" "Not yet," I said.
He nodded again.
Not with judgment. With the specific understanding of a professional who has spent 20 years watching people's financial decisions catch up with them in ways they did not anticipate. "When does he find out?" he asked. "At closing," I said. The closing was scheduled for August 12th, 2022. Constance's office. 10 o'clock in the morning. I told James on August 1st. I want to be honest about this conversation because it was the hardest one in this entire story. Not the document. Not the non-renewal letter. Not the due diligence findings or the negotiation, or any of the professional elements of what I had been building for 5 months. The conversation with James on August 1st at our kitchen table, where I laid out everything I had done and everything I was about to do, was the hardest 11 minutes of this story. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He is the kind of person who processes by listening fully before responding, which is one of the things I love most about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You've been working on this since March," he said.
"Since February," I said.
"Since the night I read the document. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to try to talk me out of it before I knew whether it was possible," I said. "And because I needed to know whether I was doing it for the right reasons before I brought you into it." "And are you doing it for the right reasons?" I thought about this carefully. "Yes," I said. "The deal is a good deal independent of who the seller is. I'm acquiring a cash-flowing portfolio at a significant discount to fair value. That would be true regardless of your parents. I would do this deal with any stranger. But it's not a stranger."
"No," I said.
"It's not." He was quiet again. "Then, what happens to them? After the closing?" "Nothing changes immediately," I said. "The Kenilworth house has a lease. Their tenancy is protected. I'm not removing your parents from their home. But you'll be their landlord." "Yes," I said. "I will be their landlord." He looked at me for a very long time. I held the eye contact because I owe him that. I owe him the full truth of whatever I am doing, visible in my face. "Is this revenge?" he asked. "It's an acquisition," I said. "The fact that it corrects a specific misunderstanding about my capabilities is a secondary benefit." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "Something more complicated." "My mother is going to lose her mind," he said. "Yes," I said.
"She is."
He looked at the table. He picked up his coffee. He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "Okay. Okay? Okay. I'm with you." He looked up. "I was always with you, Serena." They were wrong. The document was wrong. Every single point of it was wrong, and I should have said that more clearly from the beginning. "You said it," I said. Not loudly enough. I reached across the table, and I took his hand. "August 12th, I said. 10 a.m. He nodded. "I'll be there," he said.
He came.
August 12th, 2022. 10 a.m. Constance Park's office was on the 23rd floor of a building on Wacker Drive. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A conference table that seated 16. Outside, Lake Michigan was the specific shade of blue it turns in August, deep and clear and utterly indifferent to anything happening in the rooms above it. I arrived at 9:15. I wore a black blazer over a white silk blouse and dark trousers and the specific low-heeled boots I wore to closings because they were comfortable and because comfort, on days when you need to be completely in your own body, is not a luxury but a requirement. My hair was pulled back. I wore no jewelry except my engagement ring, the ring James had given me in September 2021, the ring I had been wearing through every evening of research and every conversation with David Choi and every negotiation call, and I wore it deliberately because I wanted it visible on my hand at the moment the document was signed. James was there at 9:30. He sat beside me, and he took my hand briefly when he sat down, and then let go because he understood that what was about to happen needed to happen with my hands free. Constance arrived at 9:40 with her associate, and the full closing package, 47 pages, tabbed, organized in the precise sequence of a transaction this size. She reviewed them with me in the 10 minutes before the seller's party arrived. I had read them 3 times already. I reviewed them again. At 10:03, Richard and Gloria Pemberton walked into the conference room with their attorney, a man named Barrett Cole who had been Richard's counsel for many years and who had, presumably, advised him through the sale process without knowing that the buyer was the woman his client had handed a 12-point document to 6 months earlier. Richard was wearing one of his bespoke suits, navy, with a pale blue pocket square. He looked the way he always looked, confident, unhurried, in possession of whatever room he was in. The performance was intact. He looked at Constance. He looked at the associate. He looked at the closing documents. Then he looked at me. His face did not immediately change. This is the thing about practice performances. They have momentum. He was already in the mode of a man walking into a closing, and that mode had its own gravity, and it carried him forward for approximately 3 seconds before his brain caught up with what his eyes were telling him. "Serena," he said. His voice was level. Not warm, not cold. Level, which was the performance of control. "Richard," I said. "Gloria, please sit down." Gloria was still in the doorway. Her expression had not passed through the same 3-second delay as Richard's. Her expression had changed immediately, the specific collapse of a very controlled face when the thing it was not prepared for arrives without warning. She looked at James. James met her gaze and did not look away. "What is this?" Gloria said. "This is a closing," I said. Whitmore Capital Partners LLC is acquiring the Pemberton Asset Management LLC portfolio. The documents are prepared. I'd like to proceed. Barrett Cole had been watching this exchange with the expression of a lawyer who has just understood that he has been operating without complete information and is rapidly recalculating the implications of that. He looked at Richard. Richard looked at the documents on the table. "You're the buyer," Richard said. Not a question. A statement delivered in the specific tone of someone who has miscalculated and is taking inventory of the extent of the error. "Whitmore Capital Partners LLC is the buyer," I said. "I am the managing member." "Barrett," Richard started. "The transaction is legitimate," Barrett said, with the resigned efficiency of a good lawyer. "The entity is properly formed, the offer was arm's length, the due diligence was complete." He paused. "Richard, I need a moment." "We all need a moment," I said. "Take whatever time you need." They stepped out into the hallway. Richard, Gloria, and Barrett. The door closed. James looked at me. I looked at the lake. "You okay?" he said quietly. "Completely," I said. The recess lasted 14 minutes. When they came back, Gloria's expression had been reconstructed, not to warmth, but to the performance of composure. Richard sat down. Barrett sat beside him. Gloria sat at the far end of the table and did not speak for the next 40 minutes. "I assume you understand why I'm the buyer," I said to Richard. "I have some guesses," he said. "Let me be specific," I said. "Not because I need to be, but because I think clarity is more useful than subtext, and I prefer useful things." I reached into my portfolio, and I placed a document on the table. It was the 12-point document. The original, still folded in half along the crease from the night I had read it. I unfolded it, and I set it flat on the table between us. Richard looked at it. He looked at it the way you look at something you created and forgot about until it reappears in a context you could not have anticipated. "Point 5, I said. "A partner whose assets are primarily income-based rather than wealth-based creates an imbalance. You wrote this 6 months ago. You were describing me." He said nothing. "I want you to understand something," I said. "I'm not here because I'm angry. Anger is inefficient, and I am a very efficient person. I'm here because this is a good deal, and because I am the right buyer for this portfolio, and because the transaction we are about to complete is fair, documented, and correct in every respect. The fact that it also corrects a specific misunderstanding about my capabilities, that is what I would call a secondary benefit." Barrett was watching me with the expression of a lawyer who is simultaneously managing his client's crisis and privately fascinated by the proceedings. The portfolio is worth approximately $13.1 million at current market valuations, I said. You're selling it to me for $10.95 million. That discount exists because of the tax lien, the balloon payment, and the general condition of your leverage ratios, all of which I found in the public record and in due diligence. I found them because this is my job, and I am very good at it. You did not anticipate that I would be the buyer of this portfolio because you had assessed me as someone who lacked the resources and capability to transact at this scale. That assessment was incorrect. Richard's jaw was tight. Not angry, controlled. He was a man who had spent 6 decades maintaining his composure in rooms where money was on the table, and he was not going to stop now. I respected that in a distant, professional way. The transaction proceeds, I said. The terms are as agreed. Your attorney has reviewed everything. There is nothing in this closing that is anything other than what it has been represented to be. I picked up the 12-point document. I folded it again along the original crease. I placed it back in my portfolio. What I would like to say before we sign, I said, is this. I love your son. I have loved him since approximately 3 weeks after we met, when he explained the structural implications of a cantilever detail to me at 11 p.m. in a restaurant that was trying to close around us. I will love him for a very long time. The question of whether I am adequate for him was settled, in my own understanding, before you wrote that document. This transaction does not change anything about my relationship with James. What it changes is your relationship with your mortgage. Gloria made a sound. It was not a word. It was the specific sound of a woman who has spent 64 years managing the narrative of her life and has just understood that the narrative has been taken out of her hands. Shall we proceed? Constance said. We proceeded. The signing took 31 minutes. Richard signed every page with the precise, deliberate signature of a man who has signed important documents his entire life and has never had to sign one on terms this unfavorable. Gloria did not sign. She was not a party to the transaction, which meant she sat at the end of the table for 31 minutes and watched her husband transfer his entire property portfolio to his daughter-in-law for $10.95 million. When the final page was signed and Constance had collected and organized the complete set, she looked at me and gave the small, precise nod of a woman who has just completed a transaction she is proud of. Congratulations, she said. Whitmore Capital Partners, LLC is now the owner of record. I thanked her. I closed my portfolio. I stood up. Richard looked at me from across the table. The performance was fully down now, not collapsed because he was too disciplined for collapse, but set aside. What was underneath, it was not the thing I had expected. It was not rage. It was something closer to recognition. The specific expression of a man who has been wrong about something important and has just had the evidence of that wrongness placed in front of him in a form that could not be qualified or contextualized away. You were very thorough, he said. I always am, I said. He nodded once. He stood. He buttoned his jacket, the automatic, habitual gesture of a man who puts himself back together through action rather than words. Then he looked at James. James held his gaze. I'll call you this weekend, Dad, he said. When you're ready. Richard nodded. He walked to the door. Gloria followed him, without speaking. Barrett followed both of them, pausing in the doorway to give me the specific look of a lawyer who has just watched something he will think about for a long time. The door closed. Let me be specific about what happened in the months following August 12, 2022. Not the dramatic version, the precise one. August 2022. I retained a property management company, not Pemberton Asset Management LLC, which I dissolved immediately after closing, to manage the portfolio. Within 60 days, I had conducted rent roll reviews on all 23 apartment units and identified 11 units where rents were more than 15% below market rate. I initiated lease renewal conversations with all 11 tenants and offered market rate adjustments with 18-month lease incentives. 9 of the 11 accepted. 2 tenants chose to vacate, and both units were re-leased within 30 days at full market rate. The net operating income of the portfolio in the first full quarter under Whitmore Capital Partners management was $287,000, a 23% improvement over the trailing 12-month average under Pemberton Asset Management. September 2022. The balloon payment on the Lake Geneva property came due. Because I had acquired the note as part of the portfolio payoff structure, a detail Constance had built into the closing documents that Richard's attorney had reviewed and apparently not fully understood. The balloon was satisfied from the sale proceeds at closing. The private lender received their $890,000. The Lake Geneva property was now unencumbered. Its current estimated market value is $2.1 million. I am renting it to a family at $4,800 per month. The family is lovely. They have 2 dogs and a vegetable garden. October 2022. The IRS tax lien on the Wicker Park commercial property was satisfied from the sale proceeds. The property, which had been underperforming, was released to a yoga studio at $6,400 per month, $1,200 above the previous tenant's rate. November 2022. James and I were married. Small ceremony, 40 people, a restaurant in the West Loop that we had been going to since our 3rd date, his college friends and my colleagues and my parents who flew in from Detroit and who cried during the vows in the uncomplicated, genuine way of people who love their daughter without qualification. Richard and Gloria attended. Gloria wore a dress that was slightly too formal for the occasion and spoke to me twice, once to say congratulations and once to ask about the canapés, which were, in fact, excellent. Richard shook my hand before the ceremony and said, "You built something real." I didn't understand that. I said, "I know." We moved on. It was not reconciliation. It was the beginning of something more honest than what had existed before, which in the long run is more useful than reconciliation. December 2022. The Kenilworth House, Richard and Gloria's home, had its lease reviewed as part of the standard portfolio audit. The lease Richard had held with Lakeside Residential Partners LP had transferred to Whitmore Capital Partners LLC at closing. The terms were unchanged. Their monthly payment was $4,200, which was approximately $800 below current market rate for a property of that size in that location. I renewed their lease for 2 years at the existing rate. I made this decision for one reason that was personal and one that was professional. The personal reason, James. He had not asked me to do this. He had not asked me for anything in this entire process except my honesty, which I had given him. But the Kenilworth house was the house he had grown up in, and the people inside it were his parents, and I was not in the business of using a real estate transaction as an instrument of punishment regardless of what the instrument had been used for by others. The professional reason, $4,200 per month in reliable, low-maintenance rent from long-term tenants who are motivated to stay is a good return on a property worth $3.1 million. The math is sound. I told Richard and Gloria about the renewal at Christmas dinner at their house, which I now owned, which was a fact that sat in the room like a piece of furniture no one had chosen to address directly until that moment. Gloria opened the renewal letter I had brought. She read it.
She looked at me. 2 years, she said.
2 years, I said. Same rate. She looked at the letter for a long moment. Then she looked up, and she said something I had not expected. Why? Because it's the right thing to do, I said. And because I know how to tell the difference between a transaction and a punishment. She nodded. She set the letter down on the table. She did not say thank you because Gloria is not a person who says thank you easily or quickly. But something in her face, the specific micro-adjustment of a very controlled expression when the framework it has been maintaining is no longer required, told me that the word was there, somewhere behind everything else, working its way forward. The Pemberton portfolio, now the Whitmore Capital Partners portfolio, currently has a combined estimated market value of approximately $16.8 million, based on comparable sales in the relevant submarkets as of this recording. The net operating income has stabilized at approximately $1.1 million annually after expenses and management fees. The portfolio is fully leased, all units at or above market rate, all properties professionally maintained. My total invested capital was $10.95 million. My unrealized gain is approximately $5.85 million. My annual cash yield on invested capital is just over 10%. It is, by any objective measure, a very good deal. Richard and Gloria are well. Richard has, in the 2 years since the closing, done something I find genuinely interesting. He has become more honest. Not in the performed way of people who have decided honesty is their new strategy, but in the quieter way of a man who has had the gap between performance and substance made permanently visible and has decided, at 67, that maintaining the performance is no longer worth the effort. He talks about money differently now, more carefully, more specifically, without the round numbers and the confident gestures. He asked me, at Easter dinner last year, whether I thought a specific mixed-use development in the suburbs was worth looking at. I told him I would pull the public record and let him know what I found. He laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I had heard from him in 4 years. Gloria and I are not close. I do not think we will be close in the way that some daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law become close. The shared history is too specific and too recent for that. But we are honest with each other in a way that we were not before, and I find honesty more useful than closeness, though I remain open to both in the long run. The 12-point document is in my files. I have not thrown it away. Not as a trophy, I am not interested in trophies. As a record, a coordinate from which a distance can be measured. The distance, as of today, is $5.85 million in unrealized equity and a marriage I believe in completely. People ask me sometimes, now that pieces of this story have circulated, in professional circles and otherwise, whether what I did was ethical. I have thought about this question with the same rigor I apply to everything else. The transaction was legal, fair, and documented. Richard received a price that, while discounted from assessed value, was fair given the actual condition of his financial position. He received all cash, a clean structure, and a fast close, advantages that had genuine value to him and that justified the discount. No one misrepresented anything to anyone. No one was defrauded. The deal was a deal. The fact that I knew more than the seller knew about his own financial position is not unethical. It is the product of professional skill applied to publicly available information. Information asymmetry is the engine of most successful private equity transactions. I simply happen to have both the skill to identify it and the personal motivation to apply that skill with unusual thoroughness. And here is what I want to say to anyone watching this who has ever been handed a document, metaphorical or literal, telling them who they are allowed to be, what they are allowed to own, what category of person they are. The document is not about you. The document is about the person who wrote it. It tells you about their framework, their fear, their need to establish a hierarchy that protects their position. It is information, not verdict. It is a coordinate, not a ceiling. What you do with it is up to you. I built something with it. Not because I needed to prove anything to Richard and Gloria Pemberton. I did not need that, and I want to be honest about that. I did not need their validation in February 2022, and I do not need it now. What I needed was to know for myself that I was who I understood myself to be. The transaction was the proof. The portfolio is the record. And here is the thing I have come to understand most clearly in the 2 years since that closing. The most dangerous thing a document like Gloria's 12-point letter can do is not wound you. The wound heals. The most dangerous thing it can do is install doubt. The quiet, persistent, 2 a.m. kind of doubt that whispers in the language of the people who wrote it. Income-based, not wealth-based. Interesting, not impressive. Adequate, not right. That doubt, if you feed it, becomes the framework you use to evaluate yourself. And if you evaluate yourself through someone else's framework, you will always come up short because the framework was designed to produce that result. The antidote to that doubt is not argument, and it is not confrontation. The antidote is work. Specific, documented, verifiable work. the kind that produces records. And records, as I have said, and as I believe with the specific conviction of someone who has spent 9 years in a profession built on them, do not negotiate. They do not negotiate. They simply stand. Records do not negotiate. So that is the story. Every document, every data point, every conversation at the kitchen table and the closing table and the Christmas dinner table. Thank you for staying through to the end. These are not short stories and they are not easy ones, and the fact that you are still here means something genuine to me. Here's my question for the comments, and I want you to sit with it. Has someone ever assessed you, formally or informally, with a document or without one, and found you insufficient? And what did you do with that assessment? Did you accept it? Did you argue with it? Did you fold it in half and put it against your chest and use it as a compass? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And I think your answer will tell you something about how you understand your own value, which is the most important financial question any of us will ever face.
Subscribe.
Turn on notifications. I have more stories, more numbers, more honest conversations about what it costs to build something and what it's worth when it's done. And to anyone sitting across from someone right now who has told them they are not enough, not wealthy enough, not connected enough, not the right kind of person for the life they deserve. The life you deserve is the one you build, not the one someone else approves. Go build it. I will see you in the next one.